Good evening, everybody. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about education funding prior to the local control funding formula and the state budget crisis between 2007-8 and 2012-13. In reference to your readings, this will bring you on a timeline basis all the way up to Proposition 30. So let's talk a little bit about revenue limits. Revenue limit funding is really about 2/3 of a school district's budget on average, and that is the piece of the budget that funds general operating programs. So it's the general fund, it's referred to as the general fund, the unrestricted general fund, the operating budget, we call it the white budget up here, but basically it's the largest block of dollars a school district receives to operate their instructional program. When I say operate their instructional program, it's used to fund teachers, classroom, supplies, materials, it's administration, it's the custodian, it's maintenance, it's a whole lot of things, but it's the general operating of the district. It's unrestricted, which means it doesn't have strings attached, and the school district has the discretion on how they allocate it and spend it. It is a calculation based on a revenue limit amount. The base revenue limit amount is a per ADA, average daily attendance amount, that a district receives annually. So average daily attendance, if you don't know what that is, if you take an average student in your class, say you have a 180-day calendar, then one student, if that student shows up every day of your student calendar, 180 days, you would be funded for one ADA times your base revenue limit amount. Base revenue limits, that's the formula. The base revenue limit is the amount. That's a unique amount per district, and it's comprised of two revenue streams. I went backwards. Okay, so sorry about that little blip. But basically, what you look at is average base revenue limits. And this is a chart just to give you a feel about what the magnitude of that is or how much it is. When you look at the statewide average base revenue limit, we fund based on three types of districts. An elementary district is 6,249. This is a 2012-13 number, by the way. High school district, 7,505, and a unified district, K-12, is 6,536. Also, when we were funding based on revenue limits, we were applying COLAs every year. We're entitled to a statutory COLA. So it gives you the amounts here to give you kind of a feel for that. But it's this revenue limit amount or something close to it, because each district's revenue limit amount is unique. That revenue limit dollar, that base revenue limit dollar, times your average daily attendance. And that gives you your annual allocation on an annual basis. So let's talk about revenue limit funding and the two streams of funds that go in to fund that formula. If you consider for a minute that you have a bucket, and that bucket represents your revenue limit formula for the amount of money that you're supposed to get for the year. Well, the formula is funded first by local property taxes. So you take whatever the local property taxes that have been collected for your district and you pour it into the bucket. Any amount that's left, if that property tax doesn't fill that bucket all the way up to the top, then you're short. And so that's when the state comes in and backfills and pays you to bring you up to the full amount of that bucket of money you're entitled to, and that's called state aid. So when you're looking at this graphic, the blue part is the property taxes, and anything below the top of the bucket that's in pink is the amount the state gives us for that. Now, there are some districts that are what we call basic aid districts. Out of the 1,000 districts in California, somewhere between 60 to 80 are basic aids, and those numbers fluctuate based on calculations every year. What happens if you have your bucket that it represents your revenue limit calculation for your school district, and you fill it up with your property taxes and it overflows? In other words, you get more property taxes than what your formula suggests that you should get. Well, for those districts, they're called basic aid districts, and that extra property tax that's over and above their formula, they actually get to keep and use. So those districts actually end up with more resources to spend on their than on their students and their instructional programs than districts that are called state aid districts. We have several of these districts in our county, and you can probably guess which ones they are. They're the several of them along the coast, the Cardiffs, the San Diegos, Encinitas, Del Mar, Rancho Santa Fe, are considered basic aid districts. Now, why are they called basic aid districts? They don't get any state aid. Well, in the Constitution, there's a constitutional guarantee that every district will receive a minimum state aid of $120 per ADA. So in the case where you're basic aid district and you're funded, your property taxes fully fund your formula, then the state is required to give you $120 per ADA. Through the budget crisis, that got reinterpreted a little bit, and so if they got categorical funds, then the state chalked that up as if they were fulfilling the $120 constitutional guarantee. So this next slide is just an interesting slide for your information, and it's basically showing you what happened during the budget crisis to school districts. At the minute, about a little over halfway, you'll see where the zero line is, and that's like a break-even line. And the bars that are in red represent the deficit factors. So what is a deficit factor? A deficit factor is, for example, if the state is going to give you $1,000, but they don't have $1,000, they only have $80 or $800 to give you. Well, your funding is $200 short. So the deficit factor is a 20% deficit factor. You're only going to receive 8 cents on the dollar because the state only has, out of that $1 million, they only have 800,000 to give you. So your entitlement of $1 million is deficited by 20%, and you will only receive $800,000. This happened throughout the years of the budget crisis. As you can see, that deficit grew. Ultimately, in 2012-13, the deficit for funds that school districts were entitled to was a minus 22.27%. So basically, during the budget crisis, the state implemented a lot of different strategies in order to cover their own deficits. And as they looked around the different programs around the states, they realized that school districts actually had money. And so what they did is they did things like mid-year cuts. They did cash deferrals, which we'll talk about a little bit. And then they just continued to deficit our funding and short us on our apportionments. So the next couple of slides are not, they're just examples of the things that occurred in the years 2007-8 all the way through 2012-13. You'll see we had mid-year cuts and the bills that were associated with it. In some of these slides you can see the deficit factors that were in play. You'll see in 2009-10 we had more deferrals, and we'll talk a little bit more about deferrals in a few minutes. Continue in 9-10, 10-11, 11-12. Huge cuts to districts, and many of you probably felt it. If your teachers, your districts responded to those cuts in a myriad of ways through layoff notices, increase in class size, furlough days. A lot of school districts did furlough days because the money wasn't coming from the state. So this particular chart is an interesting chart. We call it the alligator chart. And if you see for this imaginary district in 7-8, they started out with a 5,700 revenue limit. That's the point where all three lines intersect at the beginning. If they had kept their same funding all the way through 12-13, that's the green line. That would have been flat funding. If they had received the statutory COLAs, when I say statutory, it's in law, if they had received all of the cost of living adjustments that they were entitled to, this particular school district would have gone from 5,700 revenue limit, base revenue limit amount per ADA all the way up to 6,748. Instead, during the budget crisis, through various mechanisms from the state, what they really ended up with, and that's the red line on the bottom, is deficited revenue limits, and so their $5,700 dropped to $5,245. This is a chart that shows you about deferrals. Let's talk about deferrals. The first deferral happened back in 2001-2, and it was really what we at the time thought was an innocuous little thing. It was some money that the state was short and couldn't pay us on June 30. So the fix was, well, instead of paying you on June 30, we'll pay you under the new state budget, and we'll just give you the money a day later on July 1. Well, you can see that initial amount, that's the light blue in 1-2, became permanent. And so we always had that little piece of money that we should have gotten on June 30 and that we received on July 1. Well, when the budget crisis hit, which when you get into 7-8, the state ran out of money. And so what a deferral is say the state owed us money, $1 million, say in June. Well, they deferred it. Instead of giving us to June, they said, well, we don't have the money, so we'll give it to you in September. They did a lot of different deferrals, and you can see the increase in deferrals over time until we got to this huge over $9 billion across the state. What does that mean? That means that money was money that the state held that districts did not have in their budgets to pay their bills. What happens when you don't have enough money to pay your bills? If you've exhausted your savings, it's just like your own budget. If you had exhausted your savings, you had to then go out and use a credit card. So many districts, most districts, had to go out and borrow money in order to pay their general operating expenses, i.e. our salaries, through this process. So not only did we not get the money that we were entitled to because we were deficited, then the money they were supposed to give us that they had, they actually deferred and moved 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes 6 months later. And so we had that issue to deal with. And then on top of that, districts have pretty regular expenses. Salaries are pretty regular over a 10, 11, and 12-month basis. And so in order to meet payroll, districts had to go out and borrow the money, thus incurring the expense of borrowing money. This last chart actually is a chart that shows what happens when you have a deferral on a state aid district. In other words, in the revenue limit, if you are a state aid district where the state gives you a piece of that, part of that bucket, they fill the bucket up to the top, then deferrals hit you especially hard, and it was an unfair hit to those kind of districts. So this is a chart of our local districts. So look at, like, on my left-hand side, the districts on the left-hand side where you see a gap between the red line, which is the state aid that's received, and the blue line, which is the state aid they should have gotten. So you can see there's a difference there. And so when you've got a gap like that where you're supposed to get state aid, and they take that chunk and they move it 3 or 4 or 5 months out of the year later on, now you're impacted. But when you look over at the other end of the chart and you look at your basic aid districts, there is no difference. So they had no or very little impact from the deferrals and thus did not have to incur the expense of borrowing money. So that, in a synopsis, is basically what happened to school districts during the state budget crisis.